So in the post-lunch competition between mind and stomach, I would rather hope that the mind will prevail, since we have a promising subject and competent speakers. From your program, you will notice that originally we were supposed to have 4 speakers. However, Mr. Gerecht had to leave us earlier because of some reasons, so that we will have the pleasure of listening to 3 speakers. Originally, I thought that Uzi Arad and Yoel Guzhansky do not need in this room an introduction, but they insisted on that. So with that in mind, I will briefly introduce the 3 speakers, starting with lady comes first. Professor Gunay is a professor of international relations and head of International Relations Department at Yildiz Technical University in Istanbul. Professor Gunay has been written extensively on any subject ranging from the Middle East, security studies, American foreign and security policies, European Union, NATO, and arms control. And the rest could be read in your program on page 5. Next to me is Professor Uzi Arad. Uzi starts with A. Uzi is currently on the faculty of the IDC Lauder School of Government. Previously, Uzi was National Security Advisor to Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and head of the Israeli NSC between 2009 and 2011. Earlier, he served as his foreign policy advisor. Currently, he was founder of at the IDS of the Institute for Policy and Strategy, and prior to his career, he was on the professional staff of the Hudson Institute and some other institutions. He was also a member of the Jaffa Center, the previous, which is currently the INSS. And last but not least, my colleague Yoel Guzhansky, who is a research fellow at the INSS. He joins the INSS after coordinating work on the Iranian nuclear challenge at the National Security Council at the Prime Minister's office, and he also writes extensively for the INSS as well as for other onlines. Now, if you take a look at the subject, arms control in a turbulent Middle East, I earlier was chatting with some colleagues and asked them if they know what our speaker will concentrate on, and he said probably only on the turbulent Middle East, and will leave arms control aside. Whether that will be the case, I have no idea, because I have no clue as to what you and me will hear from our 2-3 speakers. But before talking to them, I somehow have put a question mark on the subject at hand, arms control in a turbulent Middle East, question mark. And I will stop my intervention only by posing the question, and I wonder whether the speakers will also address it in the course of their introductory remark. And I think that when one speaks about arms control, generally speaking, one has to ask what are the prerequisites in order to launch an arms control process, be it in the Middle East or elsewhere. Now, given the current turmoil, turbulent situation in our region, I think that the region as such is not conducive for meaningful arms control, and the question is what kind of steps one could take in order to pave the way for what could ultimately be a meaningful arms control process. Those are the questions that I have in my mind. Now, let's turn first to our speakers, and I'll start with Uzi, and then Yoel, and finally, ladies come first. At the end, will Professor Gunai also talk. We have 1.5 hours, and I would highly appreciate if each and every one of you will be able to confine to 20 minutes so as to allow subsequently a meaningful Q&A. So, Uzi, please.
Well, thank you, Shimon. And since we've known each other for so long, often by arguing over issues, and you were always right, I was always wrong, but the arguments were good. I will continue in that tradition and will defy your instructions, stretching the concept of arms control to cover practically everything as it does. Do you think people who select targets for nuclear use call themselves targeteers? No, they call themselves arms controllers, which is precise enough. So one can stretch up to the limit. I also enjoyed the fact that in reading my work, I got indirectly a very good point of success in the fact that my service, which is what I did most of my time in the Mossad, was not mentioned. You see, 25 years, a big black hole in my life, and that was omitted. That is the true mark of secrecy. And therefore, thank you for that. But in truth, the reason I refer to that, in addition to having been pleased that this was kept as it should, not made explicit, but many of the observations that I will be making on the subject will be from someone who had looked and worked on those issues as an intelligence man. And intelligence is a profession which requires sometimes to spell things as they are. And it is in that capacity that I worked most of my life on these issues. Now, that is why I would like to start by saying a disclaimer. You see, I did start my work on nuclear issues under Herman Kahn more than 45 years ago, I think. And working with Herman Kahn was always a very powerful impression. But the most important thing that he used to say at the beginning of everything is making a long list of disclaimers. He said that more than the title, it is the disclaimer that matters. So here is my disclaimer. None of what I will be saying does contain any intelligence in the narrow sense and possibly in the wider sense, and none of it reflects official policy. So these are just ruminations, reflections, thoughts, observations, remarks, and some of them even ironical, in the sense of the Hermanesque style of things, saying things sometimes to provoke thinking, or thinking about certain issues, because on those issues, thinking is a difficult part. So I will be making some thoughts, and please excuse me for that, but again, I reiterate, none of what I will be saying reflects on official Israeli policy, official Israeli actions, unless I will say explicitly so. And I can tell you that I will not have to rely on foreign sources. Foreign sources are about as reliable as any other sources, which means not much. I will rely only in one case on an authoritative figure, which is the former Israeli Minister of Defense, Ehud Barak, one of the most knowledgeable persons who at a moment of candor a few months ago did give quite interesting expose of official thinking on matters. But other than that, it would be my own thoughts only. And my comments, therefore, would be reflections on strategic way of approaching the issue of threshold, nuclear states, and how to look at it. Now, there are two observations to make in that connection. One is that there is the ex post ex ante aspect. That is to say, to look ahead, that is to say, ex ante, is the centerpiece of any thinking about the future. And most of what we will be doing is reflecting about the future. But the future is very difficult to think about. In fact, it's never more than speculative. And speculative, you don't have even intelligence on that unless it is a very detailed type of intelligence. But can you rely on the other party to uphold what he said that he means or intends? That is not even certain. So the future is very much fuzzy, and in this world, fuzzier than ever. So that is the ex ante. But the ex post is also interesting. So with this kind of looking backwards to lessons learned, or more than that, what ifs, would make for an interesting self-examination, and I would venture to do that, looking at the threshold issue and into policies, both ex post leading to ex ante. The other thing to remember, that although we talk about thresholds, it is not the threshold state that defines the issue. We'll spend a minute about defining that concept. But it is who is confronting the threshold country and what other forces that country has to cope with. It is an adversarial relationship, which makes it a strategic issue. Strategy exists only when you have at least two parties, one trying to foil the other's purposes. That's strategic interaction. And in essence, the threshold issue becomes a contest between parties. Therefore, you have to look at the object itself, but also at the same time about those who may be trying to prevent or to stop or to arrest or to derail or to encourage. So we have to look at both sides of that coin. Now, with this in mind, let me start with some wisdom, not of crowds, but the wisdom of hindsight. Now, with the wisdom of hindsight, of course, is easy to come by, and it is highly hypothetical, but still it's a good exercise. And let me suggest we try to look at it. But before we do that, let us define what is threshold. Threshold has been all kind of definitions, but also all kind of measurements. How do you measure? Is it just capability for breakout capacity, or is it the crossing of certain threshold, the one which is the most obvious, testing, demonstrating, or whatever? These are things that can be discussed and have legal and normative consequences. But there is a low common denominator. And the low common denominator, the threshold countries, refer to countries that have certain capability that brings it close to, should it so decide, break out and develop some operation capability within some distance. How do you measure distance? That's another measurement problem. Now, that term of threshold has been referred to many countries. You see that Brazil, Japan, they're referred to threshold just because they have capability. Shalom. And also, you have that about those countries which are not the non-NPT signatories, which have been suspected of having capabilities but have not tested until such time. They were often referred to a threshold. But I think that the definition is so wide and fuzzy that, in fact, you can satisfy yourself with the problem of those who have that common denominator and then start discussing that. Now, when it comes to Israel, Israel had taken a particular interest in the potentially threshold countries of the Muslim world. And again, when I look at my own professional involvement, I can tell you that we dealt with Pakistan, with Iraq, with Iran, with Syria, with Libya, with Egypt, and sometimes with Algeria. In fact, and recently I'm told that Sudan should also be looked at, which I think is ridiculous. But those countries were, and indeed Pakistan did eventually become, Iraq could have become had it not blundered, Iran may become, Egypt decided not to, Saudi Arabia is pondering, and so Israel has always taken interest in those countries that have such capability in the region. Mind you, Pakistan being Islamic. Also in our connections with proliferators east and west, and north, Russia being north. So we've taken a very clear interest in the matter. Also, over time, if you judge by Israel's action, it did develop a strategy which was very, very explicit in being a prevention strategy, but prevention carried almost to extremes, because it is the only country that on a number of times did target and attack militarily nuclear sites. Quite a risky operation and requires a strong judgment. That has not been the policy of others who have practiced preventive techniques. In fact, the US has been leading the world in the employment of a variety of instruments for prevention, legal, military, diplomatic, economic, all the range, but fell short of attacking militarily in this fashion the way Israel did, according to foreign sources. But in one case, you need not say that even. Anyway, so we had a very active. By the way, the real significance of the concept of threshold is not that it separates conditions, but it essentially separates the two counter-proliferation strategies, that of prevention, which when you practice it only until such time that the threshold had been crossed, then you can perhaps prevent vertical proliferation, but horizontal, it's a done deal. And then you enter into the other world of, inevitably so, of deterrence. Since those two postures are, as policies, very distinct, immensely distinct, the fact is that the threshold is the barrier that separates them, not in any precise form, but that is essentially the barrier. Now let's do the hindsight thing. Since the ultimate instrument in preventing could have been the military force, why was it used and why was it not used, even in the case of Iran? Well, I'll tell you that some non-Israelis are looking backwards and think in terms of regretting missed opportunities. Now, regretting missed opportunities is an interesting function. Remember, there are some people who say that criteria for decisions could be either to maximum gain, or to minimize cost, or to minimize regret. Edith Piaf did not think that way. She thought she never regretted anything, but we Jews, we regret everything. It is in our psyche. So we always bicker and regret. So there is a point to think, do we have to regret any missed opportunities? I'll tell you that non-Israelis do think that in the Iranian story, yes, we did, that Iran was taking interest in military nuclear affairs, I can tell you, started long ago. I wouldn't divulge too much by saying I met some Iranian nuclear guys long ago, and we've been working on that long ago. But we're not going into the 90s or even 80s. Let's start with this millennium. At this millennium, we had one glorious opportunity. And when I say we, I don't mean Israel. I mean the coalition has been battling proliferation, which has America as its head. And not only America, other allies, Britain, France, others. And that came in 2003. I'm taking you back into that period. 2003, the Natanz, a secret enrichment facility, was exposed in 2002. That was the smoking gun. Because we needed a smoking gun for violations. Even in the mid-90s, we thought that some of their tricks could provide for taking the matter to the Security Council, claiming that they were in material breach of their obligations. But Natanz, that was a godsend. And that happens in 2002, secret enrichment facility in the process of being built. But at that time, the US was before the Iraqi episode. It was flexing its muscle. It announced the doctrine of preemptive measures. It declared an axis of evil, which included Korea, Iran, and Iraq. And it was on the verge of going and attacking someone, and everybody thought, who would be the recipient of that attack? And its stature to do so was very high, the credibility was very high, the capability was very high, and the targets were so few. And instead of attacking Iran, which it could, it attacked Iraq, which it lived to regret. Now, this is not only hindsight, folks. I did discuss the matter in Washington in 2002 and 3. I asked, why go after Iraq? Iraq is a spent force. By the way, Iraq did nothing that they could be blamed on at the time. It was under sanctions regime, which essentially removed the nuclear issue for all practical purposes, the chemical issue for all practical purposes, and the biological, which we never found. So why Iraq? The answer was that Iraq was a more ripe case because it was internationally delegitimized. So it was politically and diplomatically, it was easier to go after. And then the answer was, once we win in Iraq, we'll be closer to Iran and we'll strike from proximity. To which I did ask the question, which every Israeli understands, and what happens if you have only one bullet in your chamber? Who would you shoot at it? The answer was Iraq, and history followed, and the opportunity was missed. One can debate, of course, that's a hypothetical, but just think sometimes hypothetically, what if instead of striking at Iraq and bringing the promises of democracy to that nation, the country that Iran was flexing its muscles would have been targeted, and the message much more surgical and potentially effective. And we know that once the attack did take place on Iraq, Iran was petrified and froze its program for 2 long years for fear that it would come next. But nothing came. So, opportunity number 1, and a road not taken. One can talk about 2006, but 2006 doesn't offer much, except that I don't want to discuss that one. But comes 2009. 2009, another pretext presents itself. Fordo, another secret facility. Into the mountains. They got caught red-handed. We had all the pretext to attack either Fordo, if you can, or Natanz, which is, why not? Well, you don't have to target exactly the place where a violation was committed. But legally speaking, one could have targeted those facilities. Instead, what was done was to use the exposure so as to enhance the sanctions regime. It was used for preventive purposes, but not to pave the way for a military strike, which could have been justified and could have been managed and would have been timely. And it was before any zone of immunity or anything had been reached, but instead it was tactically used with much deliberation to bring the coalition of the Security Council, to get the Russians and the Chinese to vote for an escalating sanctions regime, and that is how it was used. Well, in that sense, it was not a missed opportunity altogether, but certainly the military option was not used when a pretext presented itself on a silver platter. And then we come to 2012. 2012, who knows? Barak would have said that was the window of opportunity that could have been used and was being missed. It is at that point, Gideon, you were right in the article that you wrote with Zaki Shalom, that's where the American military option began to vanish, and vanishing very fast. And it was noticed every place, particularly in Tehran. Now, that was a very missed opportunity, which is not only deflected the option that was very much in the air, but could have served to strengthen the hand of the negotiators when they came, but it was done prematurely. And in so doing, it removed the military option from the real air, and in its followed suit was the Israeli reference of its own residual or separate or independent capacity to do the same, and that must have weakened the negotiating position of the negotiators where negotiations started. This was not used to strengthen sanctions, so even the sanctions lever was diluted, And it is against the backdrop of this weakened negotiating position that a deal has been negotiated. It's not been concluded, but the only question is how bad it's going to be. And it's going to be bad because it was done with the absence of sufficient bargaining capacity by misjudging, mistiming, and missing opportunities. And that is the wisdom, if there is any wisdom in this, of hindsight. But again, hindsight is very treacherous. So that brings us to the ex ante situation. What are we to do? Let me here throw in an observation about Israeli strategy, and I will not be more explicit. Do look at Netanyahu's steps. Netanyahu was voted into office second time around in the spring of 2009. In the month of May, he travels to Washington, and in the month of June, he travels to Berlin. In Washington, as made explicit that year and the next year, he reiterates strategic bilateral understandings between him, Israel, and America on matters that pertain to Israel's own positions on the issue. And then, at the same visit, he establishes a high-level coordinating mechanism to coordinate with the American government at the highest levels, White House and the Prime Minister's office, matters on Iran, on a level that has never been accomplished before. The first action, the second action is for the preventive option, but the understandings reached on the bilateral level refer to Israel's policy and posture on these issues. And American assurances were given that it would remain intact and unaffected. Now, that is a manifestation of a strategy, and Yoel, this is for you, because yesterday you mentioned to me the usefulness of the concept of hedging. That's hedging par excellence. But if you want to understand that any more, watch what was accomplished just a month later. In Berlin, Netanyahu agrees with Merkel on the supply of submarine number 6 with an option of 7. That is not in the context of prevention. So what is the hedging? The hedging is that any prudent defense planner, when looks at the possibility of proliferation and dealing with threshold countries, and Israel has always been preoccupied with the possibility of a hostile country in the Middle East that would come into possession of such weapons. Any defense planner that thinks about it does two things. Tries to do as much to prevent, using all the instruments in the template, with allies, particularly with the United States. And it is the United States that actually had removed from the list some of the countries. Libya is a British-American exercise. On Syria, we heard today that it was very late in the game that we came to notice that. Iraq, of course, that's America, and Iraq's own doing. Iran, we wanted America to take the lead as well, and it should lead not from behind. But all these efforts were led by the U.S. U.S. is indispensable in this domain as well. So prevention should be attempted and used to the hilt. But one cannot gamble on guaranteed success. In fact, you have to incorporate into the equation the possibility of bad luck, bad management, failures, everything. And you don't leave things to chance. Therefore, you do, in parallel, all the necessary measures that should prevention fail, you have your security sustained otherwise. And how that is the otherwise, that otherwise is very clear. And that's why the investment in the bilateral understandings with America that the president made explicit the next year in statements that he gave, in assurances that he gave. And Shimon, you were so right when you draw attention to the fact that only recently America stood up by a commitment that it gave in 2009 and 10 again. It was 10 about the Middle East nuclear-free zone. Those commitments were made, and they are part and parcel of what is needed in the eventuality of a possible failure of prevention. But this is not to say that one should depart from this hedging strategy. In fact, probably it has to be maintained throughout. But it is a dynamic strategy because the other party is trying to, of course, to overcome that problem through a variety of means. So I would suggest that even as we look ahead into the strategies that would have to be employed by how to deal with threshold countries, we should think strategically, and we should also employ those terms that Yoel, you have brought from the world of risk management. But here, just as I cautioned against reliance on hindsight, let me caution you against reliance on risk management. Risk management, which I liked very much and did employ a great deal, carries its own risks. I call it the risks of risk management, because the very practice of risk management techniques may change the nature of the risk and also cause risk unto themselves, and one should be very cognizant of that. To give as an example, I'm coming back to the military option. What happens when you have a threshold country is that this brings into the question even more so the option of preemption. Now, this is no longer prevention in the wider sense. It is preemption in a tactical, in conditions, for example, as the response to a violation of an agreement reached. We do not know what stipulations were to be made in this agreement and what assurances will be made with Iran about what to do if caught in violation. I am very disturbed by the fact that there is only mention of economic sanctions being snapped. That is clearly insufficient, but this does not preclude the fact that the preemptive option would surface no matter what, even if it is because one should consider what to do in the face, not of violation, but about the possibility that a nuclear state is about to position itself. So the temptation and the impulse for preemption becomes more acute when you enter the domain of a country which is threshold and may be nearing or even sitting on that threshold. Now, what is preemption? Preemption is the absolute abstract manifestation of a rule that exists in risk management, which is called the precautionary principle. That is to say that you are ready to take very high risks on yourself and to intervene very aggressively, just as to preempt a worse event which may be less costly, but you do not and you cannot afford to wait until it materializes. So here is the paradox. Out of prudence, you act imprudently. And the temptation to preempt becomes all the more acute. Now, mind you, if Iran becomes threshold, Saudi Arabia could also position itself in an analogous position technically. So we have possibilities of preemption coming from more than one quarter. So preemption becomes a real issue, and instabilities become much greater at the time. Now, if that would be the option, it brings into the question of the military strike again and again, and the dilemma would be ours. The dilemma would be ours, would be the United States in case of violation, and it may come too late, one doesn't know. To my mind, the president was underestimating his options. When the president said that military action can only accomplish a few years of postponement, I don't know what he was talking about. You know, I once joked with my American interlocutors. I told them, why don't give us Israelis a week to plan American strike actions? We'll let you a week to plan Israeli. Just give us the toys, and we can show you what we can do with toys like that. What is this? Just to end? You know, the Daesh you can degrade and destroy, but fixed targets made to be destroyed cannot be hit? What is this? So again, he was weakening his own negotiating position, but I don't know why he did it. The point is that risk management may become now the rule by which everybody would behave including the Iranians. They too will not want to highlight the risk. That is why I venture to suggest that even if there is an accord, which is not sure, the likelihood would be that on the short term it would be relatively stable and there would be some temporary equilibrium. But the passage of the time will increase the disequilibrium and the strategic forces would come into play. And when they would come into play, they would generate all kinds of forces, some destabilizing, but precisely because stability may be not only in Israel's or America's interest, but also Iran's interest. Because, as was discussed today and other times, one is not clear who is benefiting from a nuclear Iran. I can tell you that Iran would be living dangerously, very dangerously, and the more they would have to think about what would happen to them in certain conditions, the more they would come to long the good old days in which they were not exposed to any such threats. But that would be spilled milk. And therefore, they too would have possibly an interest in preventing some accidents or things like that, and there comes the role of arms control. But arms control, you would see it coming, just as is in the nature of such unstable, potentially unstable strategic equilibria. They will come into play, but they would have to be tailored, and everything here is tailored to the target at hand. It would have to be tailored to the Iranians and to the other actors involved. So we're in for a very bumpy road. And again, hindsight did suggest that we could have acted wiser had we been timed certain things and used instruments at our hand in better ways. The same is true of the future. One has to read the situation very prudently, very effectively, and should one tread that course cautiously and without making unnecessary mismanagement mistakes, then I'm pretty confident that our security would be secure. But it would be a very risky world that we'll have to cross. And again, risk management will be practiced, including hedging and other instruments. But there is a danger in its very use because it highlights the need to address risks, and the more you address risks, they may become self-fulfilling. Very difficult. So tighten your seatbelts.
Thank you.